A blonde finish, lacquer tinted. Curves and angles, means business. Wood grain, not printed. I saw you in the thrift store. Drove 30 minutes, maybe more. Your cost, well, it was near my limits. Took you home, left you alone, but now it's time to make you refined. I rescued this blonde, mid-century modern dresser at a thrift store I do not normally go to. Compared to my recent projects, this dresser was in decent shape. The blonde, tinted lacquer finish makes the dresser look like it's plastic instead of wood. The bottom of the dresser had clearly been exposed to water, which caused the particle board to expand and subsequently causing the front bottom of the dresser to completely fall off. Fun times were not had by all, especially this dresser. Well, if you've made it this far and haven't fallen asleep, let's go ahead and make this dresser look fancy. Yeah. Okay. We need to fix the bottom of the dresser to give it a bit more stability. Before I do that, I'm going to get the drawers out of the way. And while I'm removing the drawers, I'm also taking the hardware off of them and setting that aside. Interesting find when removing the hardware was the original plastic from the dresser was still under the hardware handles. I've never seen that before. Comment below if you've actually seen that, because I thought that was kind of weird. The particle board on the bottom of the dresser has to go. For this dresser to be more stable, we're going to have to chop off the sides. Before I cut the sides off, I'm going to take some time to remove the obstructions. Next, I'm going to frame out some scrap board that I have to fit in the bottom of the dresser. This is going to, 1, add reinforcement to the bottom, and 2, allow me to add some legs. I'm only cutting 3 boards for this project because adding a board to the back isn't really going to add much reinforcement. We will have 2 on the sides and then 1 on the front. After I cut the boards out for the base frame, I'm going to also cut the bottom particle board pieces off of the dresser using my jigsaw. You could also use a circular saw if you have one. I'm measuring the cut so that the bottom of the particle board stops just a hair above the front trim board. I started to cut the board but noticed some splintering going on, so I grabbed some tape and I taped the edge to help reduce that. It was not a perfect solution, but it did minimize the impact. This part was probably overkill, but I had some hobby board in my wood stash that I ended up gluing to the center of the base. I didn't really need to do this part, but my thought was it would get better balance when I added the center board. However, the board wasn't really thick enough to really add that extra support. To connect the boards together, I'm going to use a Craig jig. I opted for the fancy version, but I have used the cheaper version as well. Both are good options if you plan on joining boards together in a simple way. It's a pretty basic setup. First, you just need to know the thickness of the board. You set the depth of the jig to that thickness. My board was 3/4 of an inch thick. Then you need to adjust the collar on the included drill bit to the same thickness, which is tightened with an included Allen wrench. Then you adjust the lock on the Craig jig. The cheaper version doesn't have this. And then you drill into the boards. It's pretty simple. I do recommend, if you can use the vacuum attachment, that you do, And if it's your first time, use some scrap wood to practice. I also want to add that there's a ton of other tutorials on how to use a Craig jig on YouTube, so I won't be going into too much detail on this. To screw the boards together, I'm using pocket hole screws. I bought this box of screws off of Amazon, and I'll link it below in the description if you're interested. The box top actually shows you what screws you need based on the board thickness. It also includes the bit needed for the screws. Once you've screwed the boards together, make sure you dry fit the boards before you apply glue. I'm coating the glue mostly around the perimeter of the boards since that's where they'll be resting on the base of the dresser. Once the glue is applied, I used hand weights to help push the boards down while I drill into the pocket holes to attach the new base to the body of the dresser. This allowed me to get better leverage so that when the screw finally did drill into the body of the dresser, it pushed the board flat or flush with the surface. Now that the base is installed, we're going to move forward with the prep. I won't be installing the legs until after I've painted. I clean the entire dresser down, inside and out, using Crud Cutter to remove any oils and grime that were on the body and inside of the dresser. After the dresser was wiped with a damp cloth, post Crud Cutter cleanup, I'm going to use stainable wood filler to fill in all the damage on the dresser. I chose to use stainable wood filler because if, for whatever reason, someone wants to strip the body down and stain it, they aren't dealing with also removing something like Bondo. Now, I will mention that the veneer on this dresser is thin, and the gouges on the body are what made me want to paint it, because I think it's going to look better in the end, as opposed to using walnut wood filler or stainable wood filler and trying to hide the blemishes. I want to stain the drawers. To do this, we need to remove the existing lacquer finish. I'm starting with my carbide scraper, but realized quickly that it will be easier if I just use stripper. I'm suspecting this dresser's veneer is fairly thin and would like to be as delicate as possible to remove it. Before I apply the stripper, I'm going to tape the inside of the drawers where the handles are so that the stripper doesn't go through the holes into the drawers, creating more cleanup later. I used Clean Strip's 15-minute formula. This is a gel or paste form. I prefer to use this stripper because it doesn't seem to dry out as quickly or go everywhere like the liquid version does. I ended up applying 2 coats of stripper to the drawers because the first round removed about half of the finish. Always make sure you're working in a well-ventilated area when using this stuff, and when possible, put down some plastic to protect your floors, because it will get on your floors. After applying 2 coats of stripper to the drawers, I neutralized the stripper using mineral spirits and fine steel wool. I noticed that several areas still had lacquer on it after I finished with the mineral spirits, so I came back in again with the carbide scraper to tackle the more difficult areas. It was a little bit easier this time, but still a very tough finish to remove. The next day I came back to give everything a nice light sanding. On the body of the dresser, I used 120 grit sandpaper in my orbital sander. The goal is to rough up the surface and to smooth out any wood filler that I had applied to it. I switched over to 180 grit sandpaper for the drawers. I could tell for sure based on the sides of the drawers that this veneer was very thin, and I didn't want to blow through it. I could also tell at this point that the veneer wasn't very high quality, with very little grain patterns popping through. I ended up going through one sandpaper pad per drawer. Even the smallest amount of leftover finish seemed to gum up the sandpaper. For the top curved drawer, I did hand sand it. You could theoretically use a foam pad on this type of drawer, but again, I didn't really want to risk this based on the thinness of the veneer. When you're hand sanding, make sure you're going with the grain, unlike when you use an orbital sander, which does not require this. I also went back after applying mineral spirits to all of the drawers and hand sanded any areas that looked like there might possibly be some finish left on it. On the body of the dresser, I used Rust-Oleum Fast Drying Primer in gray, and once it's dried, I came back in with some 180 grit sandpaper that I used previously for the drawers, and just knocked down any of the little bumps or particles that had landed in the primer when it was drying. I ended up using a tack cloth to remove the dust that had settled on the dresser. For the body of the dresser, I chose Vagabond Blue by Melange paints. This is a mineral paint that has nice self-leveling properties and is made in Sugar Land, Texas. This color is a dark blue with a gray tone to it, and I ended up applying 4 thin coats to the dresser. I sanded with 400 grit sandpaper by hand after the 3rd coat before applying my final coat of paint. I did have some issues on my 3rd coat where the paint dried out faster than normal, so I just added a little bit of water to the paint, and this helped my 4th coat go on smoother. General Finishes doesn't have a dark walnut stain available in their oil-based gel stain. I wanted something in between antique walnut and Java for this project, so I mixed the two in an approximate 50-50 ratio. I used my antique walnut can for this since I didn't have a ton of stain left in it, and I made sure to stir it up thoroughly. And of course, make sure if you're using or making any custom blends of anything that you label it appropriately. I applied the stain using a foam brush to help me get in that groove detail on the top drawer, and used that for all of the drawers. I immediately wiped back the stain after it had been applied to the entire drawer. To seal the drawers, I used Varathane's Ultimate oil-based aerosol satin polyurethane. I applied 3 coats to the drawers. Before I applied my final coat, I took a piece of 400 grit sandpaper and lightly sanded over the surface before applying my 3rd and final coat. For the body of the dresser, I'm using General Finishes High Performance Satin Water-Based Top Coat. You don't want to use an oil-based poly for sealing paint colors other than black. I tinted the poly with a little bit of paint to help the poly blend in better with the painted surface. I applied the top coat to the dresser using a dampened foam brush. I applied a total of 3 thin coats and sanded with 400 grit sandpaper after the 2nd coat before applying my 3rd and final coat. The handles had this gold-plated coating on them, so we need to change that. I used some Dawn dish soap and vinegar in warm water, and I scrubbed the hardware and let it soak for about an hour before rinsing it dry. I chose Krylon All-in-One Matte Black Spray Paint on the handles. I applied 2 coats to the back and front of the handles. Next up, we need to attach the new legs to the bottom of the dresser. I marked the holes for the legs on the base of the dresser so that I could pre-drill the screw holes. This will ensure the wood doesn't crack or split when screwing the legs in. The included screws with these legs were trash. I ended up using 1-inch wood screws that I picked up from the hardware store. These will hold the legs on better in case someone decides to slide the dresser across the floor instead of lifting it. For the finishing touches on this dresser, I cleaned up the insides again with some orange glow. I ran out of Howard's orange oil, and this worked well to add some hydration to those interior surfaces. I applied some Howard's Feed and Wax to the drawer glides on the bottom of the drawers and the slides on the inside of the dresser to help the drawers open more smoothly. Let's take a gander at what we started with and where we ended up. I hope you enjoyed this furniture transformation. If you could boop that little like button there, that would greatly help me out. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.